The day my husband died, the world was already quiet. Not the kind of quiet you get after midnight when the city exhales. Not the peaceful kind. This quiet was heavy. Suspended. Like even the sky was holding its breath. It was April 2020. Ambulance sirens had become background noise by then. You heard them the way you hear wind, constant, unavoidable, no longer shocking. But the one that came from Marcus, that one split my bones open. I remember the smell of bleach before I remember the sound of the siren. I had wiped down the kitchen counters 3 times that morning. The news said sanitizes everything. The news said stay inside. The news said older people were dying. Marcus was only 46. He stood in our living room gripping the back of the dining chair like it might float away. Sweat beaded along his hairline. His breathing sounded wrong. Wet. Shallow. "Baby, I'm okay," he said, but he wasn't looking at me when he said it. I knew then. You don't stay married 22 years without learning the language of a man's eyes. The paramedics wouldn't let me ride with him. Pandemic protocol. That phrase still makes my jaw tighten. I stood in the doorway of our little brick house and watched them close the ambulance doors like they were sealing a vault. I never saw him alive again. The hospital called 3 days later. No visitors allowed. No goodbyes. Just a nurse with tired eyes holding a phone to his ear while I told him I loved him, not knowing if he could hear me. And then he was gone. The funeral was 6 people spaced apart in folding chairs. Masks. Gloves. No hugging. My mother dabbed at her eyes but kept her distance. My sister Patrice stood stiff as wood. Marcus's brother left early because he didn't want to catch anything. Grief in isolation does something strange to you. It doesn't explode. It seeps. The house felt too large afterward. Every room carried his outline. His boots still sat by the door. His coffee mug had a faint ring at the bottom. Thank you in advance. And you, what would you do in this person's place? I would love to hear your opinion, so please share it with me in the comments. I'm always curious about what you all think, and also write me where you heard this story. For more life stories like this, like the video and subscribe to my channel. There are many other stories waiting for you. With heartfelt greetings. His cologne lingered in the closet like a ghost that refused to move on. At night I would lie on my side of the bed and stare at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. I kept expecting to feel the mattress dip beside me. Silence became my roommate. And then came the second blow. 3 weeks after the funeral, I opened the mail and saw the notice from the bank. Marcus had handled most of the larger bills. We had talked about it, sure, but in that casual way couples do when they believe they have time. We did not have time. His construction company had already slowed because of lockdowns. Payments were behind. Insurance only covered so much. I sat at the kitchen table staring at numbers that looked like accusations. Mortgage. Utilities. Insurance. I pressed my fingers against my temples and whispered, "Okay, Lord. What now?" That's when I called my family. I don't know what I expected. Maybe comfort, maybe direction. Maybe someone to say, "We got you." Instead, I got silence wrapped in practicality. "You might have to sell the house," Patrice said over speakerphone. "It's too much for one woman alone," my uncle added. My mother cleared her throat. "You could come stay with me for a while." Stay with her. At 44. In the same bedroom I left when I married Marcus. I stared at the living room wall, at the faint indentation where Marcus once mounted a television crooked, and laughed about it for weeks. "I'm not leaving my home," I said quietly. There was a pause. The kind that carries judgment. "Well," Patrice sighed, "you always were stubborn." They weren't cruel. Just doubtful. That doubt settled in my chest like a second grief. The world was collapsing outside, and inside my own family I felt minimized. Like I was already a widow-shaped shadow instead of a whole woman. But here's the thing about silence: if you sit in it long enough, you start hearing yourself. One evening, about a month after Marcus passed, I was standing in the kitchen rolling out dough. It was muscle memory. When I'm overwhelmed, my hands need something to do. I used to bake for church events. Pound cakes. People were scared to leave their homes. Neighbors were posting online asking if anyone had fresh bread or home-cooked meals because shelves were bare. I stood there holding a warm loaf in my hands, steam rising against my face. And for the first time since the ambulance doors closed, I felt something other than grief. I felt possibility. It wasn't loud. It didn't roar. It whispered. The next morning, I created a simple post on Facebook. Homemade bread and baked goods available. Contactless porch pickup. Message me. I almost deleted it 3 times. What if nobody ordered? What if they did and I couldn't handle it? What if my family laughed? I pressed post anyway. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and waited. Within an hour, I had 5 messages. By dinner, I had 15. By the end of the week, I had more orders than I had flour. I remember standing in line at the wholesale store, mask tight against my face, heart pounding not from fear of the virus but from something unfamiliar: momentum. When I told my family, they responded the way people do when they don't quite believe you. "That's nice," Patrice said. "A hobby is good for keeping busy," my mother added. A hobby. I didn't correct them. Because I wasn't sure yet myself. The days became a blur of kneading, mixing, packaging. I printed labels from my old home printer. I wiped down every surface twice. Customers would wave from their cars as I placed boxes on a small folding table at the edge of the porch. Some left thank you notes. One elderly neighbor slipped a $20 bill into an envelope and wrote, "This tastes like my mama's kitchen." I cried after reading that. Grief and gratitude feel similar in the body. Both make your chest ache. But orders kept increasing. I began waking up at 4 a.m. The house would be dark, the air cool. I'd tie my headscarf tight, turn on the kitchen light, and let the rhythm of measuring and stirring carry me. Flour under my nails. Butter soft against my palms. The low hum of the refrigerator. Outside, the world felt dangerous. Inside, my kitchen felt like control. 3 months in, I had to make a decision. Either this remained a small side hustle, or I treated it like survival. The bank wasn't waiting. Bills don't care about grief. One afternoon, Patrice stopped by unannounced. She stood on the porch, mask dangling from one ear, looking at the stack of boxes beside the door. "You're really doing this?" she asked. "Yes." "You think baking is going to pay a mortgage?" Her tone wasn't malicious. Just doubtful. Again. I met her eyes. "I don't think. I know I have to try." She shook her head slightly, like I was a child insisting on something unrealistic. "Don't get your hopes too high," she said softly. "The world is unstable." I watched her drive away and felt something firm inside me. It wasn't anger. It was resolve. That night, I sat in Marcus's old office chair. His cologne still faint in the fabric. I opened my laptop and researched how to register a small food business in our state. Licenses. Permits. Insurance. Words that once intimidated me now felt like stepping stones. I whispered into the empty room, "Baby, I'm about to build something." The grief didn't disappear. I still reached for him in the dark sometimes. I still paused when I heard sirens. But alongside the sorrow, something else was growing. Determination has a scent. It smells like early mornings and ambition. It sounds like oven timers and keyboard clicks at midnight. By the time summer came, I had a name. Marcus and Joe's Kitchen. People asked why I included his name. Because he was the first one who believed I could. And belief, I was learning, is fuel. I didn't know then that within 2 years, that small Facebook post would turn into distribution contracts across state lines. I didn't know I would hire women who had lost jobs during the pandemic. I didn't know my family would one day stand in a building with my logo across the front and look at me differently. All I knew was this. The world shut down. My husband died. And I refused to disappear with him. So I kept baking. And somewhere between flour and fire, I began rising too. By August, my kitchen no longer belonged to me. It belonged to timers and invoices and the low mechanical rhythm of a second-hand industrial mixer I bought from a restaurant that had gone out of business. The man who sold it to me didn't even look me in the eye when I handed over the cashier's check. "You sure you can handle this?" he asked, glancing at my hands like they were too soft for machinery. I didn't answer him. I just wrapped both arms around that mixer like it was a newborn and said, "Load it up." Every dollar I spent felt like a risk I could not afford, and yet not spending it felt like surrender. Orders had tripled by then. What started as bread and pies had expanded to full family meal packages. People were tired of cooking. Tired of fear. Tired of canned food. They wanted warmth. They wanted something that tasted like somebody still cared. And I gave them that. I moved the dining table out of the living room and converted the space into prep storage. Folding racks lined the wall. Ingredients were labeled in thick black marker. I created spreadsheets. I tracked every cent. I had never seen myself as a businesswoman. That word used to conjure images of tailored suits and corner offices. Me? I wore leggings dusted in flour and an apron that carried the faint scent of vanilla and yeast. But I was learning something quietly powerful. Business isn't about the outfit. It's about decisions. And I was making them every day. The exhaustion came slowly. It lived in my shoulders first. Then in the small of my back. I would lie down at night and feel my pulse in my wrists, still vibrating from kneading dough for 12 hours. Sometimes I would sit on the edge of the bed and stare at Marcus's empty pillow. "I wish you were here to see this," I would whisper. The loneliness didn't fade just because I was busy. If anything, success sharpened it. I wanted to turn and share the moment with someone who remembered when it was just an idea spoken over late-night leftovers. Instead, I celebrated alone. When I secured my first small catering contract with a local hospital. Boxed comfort meals for nurses working double shifts, I sat in my car afterward and cried. Not delicate tears. Full-body sobs that left my chest aching. Because I had done it. And because nobody in my family had asked how things were going in weeks. They saw my social media posts. I knew they did. They would like a picture here and there. My aunt once commented, "Look at you staying busy." Staying busy. They still didn't understand. Or maybe they didn't want to. One Sunday afternoon, my mother called. "I heard from Sister Helen that you're delivering food to the hospital now." "Yes, ma'am." "Well, just don't overextend yourself. You don't want to embarrass yourself if you can't keep up." Embarrass myself. The words were soft but sharp. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. "I'm managing." "You've always been ambitious," she said carefully. "Just remember, pride comes before a fall." When we hung up, I stood in the kitchen staring at the wall clock ticking loud as judgment. I wasn't angry at her. I was tired of being underestimated. There is something uniquely heavy about being a black woman with vision. People applaud your strength but question your scale. They admire your hustle but doubt your sustainability. They expect you to survive. They don't expect you to expand. By winter, I could no longer do it alone. My hands were cracked from constant washing. My wrists throbbed at night. Orders were spilling over into weeks-long waiting lists. So I made another decision. I hired help. The first woman I brought on was Denise. A single mother who lost her hotel job when tourism collapsed. She showed up to the interview in a neatly pressed blouse and eyes that carried both hope and caution. "You ever worked in food service?" I asked. "No, ma'am," she said. "But I learned fast. And I'm not scared of hard work." Neither was I. I hired her on the spot. Training her felt strange at first. This business had been my private grief therapy. Letting someone into the rhythm of it felt intimate. But Denise caught on quickly. She hummed while she worked. She double-checked measurements. She thanked me every single day before leaving. "You don't know what this means," she said once, pulling her coat tight before stepping into the cold. "My babies get Christmas because of this." That night, I sat in the quiet house and let that settle into my bones. My babies get Christmas because of this. This was bigger than mortgage payments now. Within 3 months, I hired 2 more women. Then a delivery driver whose hours had been cut elsewhere. The house could no longer contain us. Flour sacks lined the hallway. Packaging supplies filled the guest bedroom. My neighbors started joking that I was running a factory. They weren't wrong. But factories require zoning permits. And one morning, a city official knocked on my door. He was polite. Masked. Clipboard in hand. "Ma'am, we've received notice of commercial-level activity in a residential property." My stomach dropped. Every fear my family had ever planted bloomed at once. Had I moved too fast? Had I been reckless? He explained the regulations. I would need a licensed commercial kitchen space if production continued at this scale. I nodded calmly while my insides spiraled. That evening, I called Patrice. For advice. For once, I needed someone to say, "You can figure this out." Instead, she sighed. "This is what I was worried about," she said. "You're biting off more than you can chew. Maybe it's time to scale back." Scale back. After everything? "I can't," I said quietly. "You can't or you won't?" The distinction stung. After we hung up, I sat alone at the kitchen table, the same table where I once stared at unpaid bills. The fear felt familiar. But so did the resolve. I opened my laptop and began researching commercial rental spaces. Most were expensive. Some were already closing because businesses couldn't survive lockdown restrictions. Then I found one. A small bakery storefront on the edge of downtown. The previous owner had retired early due to health concerns. The space came with industrial ovens, stainless steel counters, and enough room to grow. The rent made my throat tighten. Signing that lease would mean betting everything. Everything. I drove past the location 3 times before calling the number on the listing. When the landlord met me for a walkthrough, he looked surprised. "You're the owner?" he asked. "Yes." He scanned me, my head wrap, my practical coat, my steady gaze. "You understand this is a serious commitment." "I do." He hesitated before handing me the paperwork. "You have backing?" "Yes," I said. And for the first time, I realized it was true. I had myself. That night, I walked through my house slowly. Past Marcus's boots. Past the framed wedding photo in the hallway. I paused in the kitchen, the room that had resurrected me. "I'm about to leave this space," I whispered. The walls didn't answer. But I felt him there somehow. Not in a mystical way, just in memory. In muscle. In the way he used to nod when I was nervous about something new. I signed the lease the next morning. The move nearly broke me. Transporting equipment. Setting up inspections. Navigating permits. There were nights I stayed in the new bakery past midnight, scrubbing floors myself because I couldn't afford cleaning services yet. Denise would sometimes stay late with me. "You good?" she'd ask gently. "I'm good," I'd reply, even when my feet throbbed and my eyes burned. Opening day came quietly. No ribbon cutting. No grand announcement. Just a sign on the door that read, Marcus and Joe's Kitchen, now open. I stood behind the counter that first morning, hands trembling slightly. What if no one came? What if my family was right? At 8:12 a.m., the bell above the door chimed. An elderly man stepped in, removing his hat. You the lady from Facebook? He asked. Yes, sir. He smiled beneath his mask. My wife said if I didn't bring home that sweet potato pie, I wasn't allowed back in the house. I laughed, a real laugh, the kind that rises without effort. And just like that, the day began. By noon, we were nearly sold out. By closing time, my feet were numb and my heart was full in a way I hadn't felt since before the hospital call. But when I checked my phone that night, there were no missed calls from family. No, congratulations. No, we're proud of you. Just silence. And that silence no longer made me small. It made me focused. Because I was beginning to understand something powerful. Not everyone who shares your blood shares your belief. And belief is what builds empires. I locked up the bakery that evening and stood on the sidewalk under the dim glow of the streetlight. The air was cold, sharp in my lungs. The city was still fragile from the pandemic. Businesses boarded up. Uncertainty everywhere. But my lights were on. I slid into my car and rested my forehead against the steering wheel for a moment. I'm not done, I whispered. I didn't know then how high this would climb. I didn't know the first betrayal would come from inside the circle. I didn't know expansion would test my marriage to grief all over again. But I knew this. They doubted me when I started. They doubted me when I grew. And one day, they would have to stand in the evidence of what I built, brick by brick, loaf by loaf, without them. And that day was coming sooner than any of us expected. The email came on a Tuesday morning at 5:47 a.m. I remember the exact time because I was already awake. Sleep had become something I visited, not something I lived in. I would drift for 3 hours, maybe 4, then snap awake with a running list forming in my mind before my feet even touched the floor. I was sitting at the small desk in the corner of the bakery office, really just a storage closet we cleared out and fitted with a second-hand desk, when I saw the subject line. Regional Grocery Chain Partnership Inquiry. For a moment, I thought it was spam. I clicked it anyway. The message was short, professional, and to the point. They had been monitoring local businesses that saw consistent growth during the pandemic. Marcus and Joe's Kitchen had strong community engagement, high repeat customers, and brand warmth, as they phrased it. They wanted to discuss carrying my baked goods in 23 stores across the state. I read the email 3 times before it felt real. 23 stores. My hands went cold. There is a specific kind of fear that comes when your prayers start getting answered at scale. Small success feels manageable. Big opportunity feels like standing at the edge of a cliff, beautiful, wide, and terrifying. Denise came in at 6, jingling her keys, humming like she always did. You look like you've seen a ghost, she said, slipping off her coat. I turned the screen toward her. She read it slowly. Then looked at me. Miss Joe. Her voice cracked before mine did. We both stood there in that cramped office, 2 women who had been underestimated in different ways, staring at a door neither of us had imagined would open so fast. This is it, she whispered. Maybe it was. But it came with numbers. Volume requirements. Packaging standards. Distribution logistics. Insurance upgrades. Production increases that would triple our output. I scheduled the call for Thursday. That gave me 48 hours to decide whether I was bold or foolish. That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I drove to my mother's house. She opened the door slowly, peering at me over her glasses. Well, this is a surprise. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of lemon cleaner and old hymn books filling my nose. The house hadn't changed in decades. Same couch. Same curtains. Same framed scripture on the wall. We sat at the dining table where I had done homework as a girl. I got an offer, I said carefully. A big one. She folded her hands. From who? I explained. Slowly. Thoroughly. I laid out the scale. The requirements. The risk. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair. That's a lot, she said. Yes, ma'am. She studied my face like she was searching for something fragile. You sure you're not reaching too far? There it was again. Not pride. Not excitement. Concern wrapped in doubt. I can hire more staff, I said. Apply for a small business expansion loan. I've already run projections. You've changed, she said quietly. The word startled me. How? You used to ask before you leaped. I held her gaze. Nobody was going to tell me to leap. Silence settled between us. I wanted her to say she was proud. I wanted her to say Marcus would be smiling. I wanted something soft. Instead, she said, just don't lose yourself chasing something too big. I left with a tightness in my chest that had nothing to do with fear of failure. It had to do with distance. Patrice. Don't Patrice me. We all thought you were playing bakery. Now you're acting like you built an empire overnight. Acting like. The phrase lodged in my throat. I did build this, I said quietly. Overnight after overnight. She was silent. Then she said something that shifted everything. You think you better than us now? I closed my eyes. No. I think I'm different than I was. She didn't respond. We hung up without resolution. That was the moment I understood something painful. Not everyone celebrates your rise. Some experience it as abandonment. And maybe, in a way, I had left them, not physically, but mentally. I was operating on a different frequency now. Risk. Vision. Expansion. They were still measuring safety. The grocery contract was signed 2 weeks later. When I put pen to paper, my hand didn't tremble. It steadied. Production ramped up like a storm gathering speed. Pallets replaced porch tables. Branded packaging replaced handwritten labels. We invested in refrigerated trucks. The first shipment went out on a gray Monday morning. I stood in the loading bay watching our logo disappear into the back of a distribution truck. Marcus and Joe's kitchen. Across the state. I felt tall. Not physically. Internally. And then my phone buzzed. A text from my mother. I saw your products at the market today. No emoji. No exclamation mark. Just that. I stared at it for a long time. Then I replied, yes, ma'am. She didn't respond. Weeks passed. Sales exceeded projections. We had to hire even more staff. My days were no longer flour and sugar. They were supply chain negotiations. Vendor calls. Quality control audits. I learned fast. Because I had to. But success has a cost. I missed Denise's daughter's birthday party because of an emergency meeting. I forgot to eat lunch more days than I could count. I drove home one night so tired I barely remembered the route. And when I walked into my house, still the same brick walls, still Marcus's boots by the door, the quiet felt louder than ever. Expansion filled my calendar. It did not fill the empty side of my bed. One evening, after a 14-hour day, I sat on the kitchen floor with my back against the cabinet and let myself cry. Not because I regretted anything. But because carrying something this big alone is heavy. I thought about calling Patrice. I didn't. I thought about driving to my mother's house. I didn't. Instead, I wiped my face, stood up, and looked around the room where this all began. You're still here, I whispered to myself. And I was. Stronger. Sharper. Less afraid. The contract expanded to neighboring states within a year. We moved into a larger facility. 30 employees. Then 50. Local newspapers began using words like phenomenon and trailblazer. My family began using different words too. Proud. Impressive. Didn't know you had it in you. But there was something in their eyes at gatherings, something complicated. A recalibration. I wasn't the grieving widow anymore. I was the woman who bet on herself and won. And winning changes how people hold you. One Thanksgiving, as I carved turkey in my mother's kitchen, my uncle leaned over and said quietly, "Guess we were wrong about you." I smiled politely. But inside, I thought. You were wrong about my capacity. Not about me. Because the woman who built this had always been there. She just needed fire. And loss. And a world shutting down long enough for her to hear her own voice. I didn't know yet that the biggest test wasn't scale. It wasn't logistics. It wasn't competition. It was loyalty. Because success doesn't just attract customers. It attracts expectation. And soon, my family would come asking, not with doubt. But with hands open. And that would test me more than any bank ever did. Success has a sound. It sounds like forklifts reversing at 6 in the morning. It sounds like delivery trucks rolling out before sunrise. It sounds like payroll notifications hitting your phone every other Friday, dozens of them. But it also has another sound. It sounds like relatives who never called, suddenly remembering your number. The first request came from my cousin Daryl. We hadn't spoken in almost a year. He called on a Sunday afternoon while I was reviewing quarterly numbers at my dining room table. Yes, I still used that same table, even though I could afford something bigger now. Some things I refused to replace. "'Cause," he said, his voice loud and overly cheerful. "Big boss lady." I smiled faintly. "Hey, Daryl. I've been watching you. You doing big things. Thank you." There was a pause, brief, but loaded. "So listen," he continued, lowering his voice like we were negotiating something confidential. "I've been thinking about getting into distribution. You know, trucking, logistics. Figured maybe you could invest. Keep it in the family." There it was. Not, "How are you?" Not, "You holding up?" Investment. I leaned back in my chair. The late afternoon sun cut across the floor in long gold stripes. I watched dust particles float in the light. "How long you been planning this?" I asked. "Oh, it's something I've been thinking about for years." Years. Funny how those years never included action until my name was in newspapers. "What kind of experience you have in distribution?" I asked gently. He hesitated. "Well, none directly. But business is business, right?" "No. Business is discipline. Business is sacrifice. Business is sleepless nights and personal guarantees on loans that can swallow you whole. Business is not vibes." "I can't invest in something without a track record," I said carefully. "But I can connect you with some resources if you're serious." His tone shifted instantly. "So that's it? After all you got?" "After all I got." As if it fell from the sky. "It's not about what I got," I replied. "It's about responsibility." He exhaled hard. "All right. I see how it is." The call ended colder than it started. I sat there for a long time afterward, staring at the screen of my laptop but not seeing numbers anymore. That was the first time I felt the shift clearly. When you're struggling, people sympathize. When you're rising, they observe. When you've arrived, they calculate. The second request hurt more. It came from Patrice. She invited me over for dinner, something she hadn't done in months. Her house smelled like baked chicken and lemon pepper. The television murmured low in the background. Her husband nodded at me from the couch but didn't say much. We sat at her kitchen table, forks scraping against plates in a rhythm that felt too polite. "I've been thinking," she began, not looking at me directly. "I want to quit my job." "Oh?" I said. "They treat me like I'm replaceable. I'm tired." I understood that feeling intimately. "So what do you want to do?" She took a breath. "I want to come work for you. But not entry level. I've got management experience." I placed my fork down slowly. "Patrice. I know the business now. I see how it's grown. You need someone you trust in leadership." The word trust hung heavy between us. "I already have department heads," I said gently. "And they've been with me through the scaling process." Her jaw tightened. "So strangers get positions but your own sister doesn't?" "They're not strangers. They're qualified. And I'm not." "That's not what I'm saying." But it was what she heard. Her chair scraped against the floor as she leaned back. "You've changed," she said again, but this time it wasn't observation. It was accusation. I felt something inside me harden. "No," I replied quietly. "I've grown." She laughed softly, but there was no humor in it. "You think you're above us now?" There it was again. Above. As if elevation automatically meant separation. "I'm not above you," I said, my voice steady. "But I am responsible for 73 employees now. I can't hand out leadership roles based on blood." Her eyes flashed. "So family means nothing?" Family had meant everything when I was drowning. But family had not shown up with life rafts. It had shown up with warnings. "With love," I said carefully, "family means boundaries too." The rest of dinner moved stiffly. Conversations shallow. Smiles thin. When I left her house, the air outside felt sharp against my skin. I sat in my car for several minutes before turning the key. It would have been easier to say yes. Easier to keep peace. Easier to blur lines. But easy is not sustainable. And I had not built this from grief and grit just to collapse it under obligation. At the next family gathering, the temperature toward me had changed. Nothing overt. Just subtle shifts. Conversations lowering when I approached. Comments like, "Must be nice," slipping in sideways. One aunt pulled me aside near the dessert table. "Baby," she said softly, squeezing my hand. "You gotta remember where you came from." I met her eyes. "I do," I said. Every day I remembered. I remembered staring at foreclosure notices. I remembered sanitizing groceries in fear. I remembered telling my husband goodbye through a phone screen. They thought success erased memory. It didn't. It sharpened it. Back at the facility, growth continued. We expanded into 3 more states. A national morning show invited me for an interview segment about resilience during the pandemic. When the producer asked, "What motivated you most?" I paused before answering. I could have said ambition. I could have said necessity. Instead, I said, silence. She blinked. Silence? Yes, I explained. When everything shut down, I finally heard myself clearly. That clip went viral. Orders surged again. And with surge came pressure. Competitors noticed us now. Emails started arriving from consultants offering to professionalize the brand. Investors wanted equity stakes. I declined most of them. Control mattered to me. Ownership mattered. Because I had already lost one thing I loved without warning. I would not lose this to greed. One evening, months after the dinner with Patrice, she showed up at the bakery unannounced. She stood in the production area watching the women move like a well-rehearsed orchestra. Hairnets. Gloves. Laughter between tasks. She looked surprised. This is bigger than I thought, she admitted quietly. Yes, I said. She turned to me. You really built all this? The question wasn't sarcastic. It was stunned. Yes. For the first time in a long time, I saw something shift in her expression. Not jealousy. Recognition. You did it without us, she said. I nodded slowly. I had to. That was the truth neither of us had spoken out loud before. Later that night, after she left, I walked through the facility alone. The hum of refrigeration units. The faint scent of sugar in the air. Clipboards neatly stacked. Schedules printed and posted. I thought about the girl I used to be, the one who deferred decisions to Marcus, who second-guessed her instincts, who asked permission for boldness. Grief had stripped that away. Responsibility had replaced it. Success hadn't changed my bloodline. It had changed my posture. But boundaries changed relationships. And I was learning that loving people does not mean financing them. Supporting people does not mean surrendering structure. Family does not mean forfeiting standards. The next morning, payroll cleared 78 employees. 78 families. 78 households with groceries and rent paid. I stood in my office and let that number settle. I was no longer building for survival. I was building for legacy. And legacy requires clarity. I didn't know yet that the next test wouldn't be about money. It would be about love. Because success makes you visible. And visibility attracts more than opportunity. It attracts attention. And soon, someone from my past would reappear, not asking for investment, but asking for me. And that would shake something I thought I had buried with Marcus. The first time I saw him again, I almost didn't recognize him. It had been nearly 25 years. Back when we were teenagers sitting on the hood of his cousin's car, sharing gas station sodas and talking about leaving our small town. Back when life felt long and wide and guaranteed. His name was Elijah. He walked into my bakery on a Thursday afternoon just after lunch rush. I was reviewing a supplier invoice at the front counter when the bell above the door chimed. I looked up out of habit. And there he was. Older, of course. Broader shoulders. A little gray along the beard. But the eyes were the same, steady, thoughtful, observant. For a second, my body reacted before my mind did. A flicker of recognition in my chest. A memory rising like heat. Elijah? I said slowly. He smiled, and it was the same sideways smile from years ago. Joanne. Nobody called me Joanne anymore. Not unless they knew me before I became Miss Joe, or Ms. Johnson, or founder. The sound of it felt like stepping into an old photograph. What are you doing here? I asked. I saw you on TV, he said. Figured I'd see it for myself. I crossed my arms lightly, not defensive, just grounding. Well, I said, glancing around the busy space, this is it. He took it in slowly. The display cases. The branded packaging. The women working behind the counter with practiced confidence. You built all this? Yes. He nodded once, like that answer made sense to him in a way it hadn't to others. I always knew you had it in you. I don't know why those words hit harder coming from him. Maybe because he had known me before I learned to doubt myself. Maybe because he said it without surprise. We talked for 20 minutes. Safe topics. Where life had taken us. He had married once. Divorced 5 years ago. No children. Moved back to the area to take care of his father before he passed. I'm sorry about Marcus, he said quietly. The way he said Marcus's name, not awkward, not competitive, settled something inside me. Thank you, I replied. When he left, he didn't ask for my number. He just said, I'll stop by again. And he did. A week later. Then 2 weeks after that. Always ordering something small. Always staying just long enough to talk. He never mentioned my success in a way that felt transactional. Never asked for favors. Never hinted at opportunity. He asked about me. "How you holding up really?" he asked one evening as we stood near the back door while employees closed up. I hesitated. The truth was complicated. "I'm proud," I said finally. "And I'm tired." He nodded slowly. "You don't let people see that part, do you?" "No." "Why?" "Because tired women get replaced. Because vulnerable women get doubted. Because I worked too hard to be perceived as fragile." But I didn't say all that. "I don't have the luxury," I replied instead. He looked at me like he wanted to argue, but didn't. For months, we stayed in that space between past and possibility. Coffee after closing. Long conversations in the empty bakery office. He listened more than he spoke. And when he did speak, it wasn't to impress. It was to understand. That unnerved me. Because understanding is intimate. And I had locked intimacy away the day the hospital nurse said, "I'm so sorry." One night, as we sat on metal folding chairs in the back storage room, the only quiet place after hours, he asked gently, "Do you ever let yourself miss being loved?" The question knocked the air from my lungs. "I was loved," I said quickly. "That's not what I asked." The hum of refrigeration units filled the silence. I thought about the bed that still felt too wide. The victories I celebrated alone. The way I instinctively handled every crisis without reaching for help. "I don't know how to need someone anymore," I admitted softly. He didn't rush to respond. "I'm not asking you to," he said finally. "I'm just saying, strength and softness aren't enemies." Strength and softness. I had built an empire on strength. Softness felt like risk. Word spread quickly once we were seen together at a community event. Phones buzzed. Messages came. Patrice called first. "So it's serious?" "It's something," I said. "You sure about this?" she pressed. "You just got stable." Stable. As if love was destabilizing by default. "I'm allowed to have a life," I replied calmly. "I just don't want you distracted." Distracted. The implication stung. As if my capacity couldn't stretch beyond one dimension. My mother's reaction was quieter. "He treats you well?" she asked simply. "Yes. That's all I care about." But I saw the concern behind her eyes. Because they remembered what it cost me last time. The first time Elijah came to my house, I almost canceled. The living room still held Marcus's framed photo. His boots were still by the door. I had never removed them. Elijah noticed. He didn't comment immediately. Later, as we sat on opposite ends of the couch, he glanced toward the hallway. "You keep him close," he said gently. "Yes." "Does it feel like betrayal to imagine moving forward?" The honesty of the question felt surgical. "Sometimes," I whispered. "Love isn't a slot that gets replaced," he said quietly. "It's not subtraction." I stared at my hands. "I don't want to lose myself again," I admitted. "You didn't lose yourself before." "I did," I said softly. "I just didn't know it." Marriage to Marcus had been loving. Solid. Safe. But I had deferred too much. Dimmed too much. Waited too much. Grief taught me who I was without leaning. Now the idea of leaning again felt like surrendering ground I fought to claim. Elijah didn't push. He simply stayed. Steady. Consistent. Patient. Months passed. My business expanded into 12 states. We began early talks about national distribution. I was traveling more now, meetings, site visits, interviews. Elijah never complained. He would send simple texts. Land safe. Eat something. Proud of you. Not performative pride. Quiet pride. And that was new for me. One evening, after returning from a 3-day trip, I found him sitting on my porch steps. I had given him a key weeks earlier, but he rarely used it without asking. "You look exhausted," he said as I dropped my bag. "I am." He stood and stepped closer. Without thinking, I leaned into him. Just slightly. And in that small, instinctive movement, something inside me cracked open. Not weakness. Relief. I had carried so much alone for so long that sharing weight felt almost foreign. Inside the house, he helped me unpack groceries I had ordered for delivery. Small domestic movements. Ordinary. Ordinary felt revolutionary. Later that night, as we stood in the kitchen, the same kitchen where everything began, he traced his fingers lightly along the counter. "This place built you," he said. "No," I corrected softly. "It revealed me." He smiled at that. "You scared?" he asked. "Of what?" "Letting someone see you without the armor." I met his eyes. "Yes." He stepped closer, not touching me yet. "I'm not here to compete with your past," he said. "I'm here because I see your future." That did it. Tears came, slow and quiet. Because being seen without being threatened is rare. And I hadn't realized how much I needed that. Our relationship didn't explode into fireworks. It unfolded. Steady dinners. Shared mornings. Long conversations about vision, about legacy, about what love looks like after loss. But success complicates romance. The higher I climbed publicly, the more visible we became privately. People speculated. Online comments analyzed. "Gold digger" appeared more than once under posts where he was tagged. He shrugged it off. "I know who I am," he said. But I knew visibility strains even strong foundations. One night, after reading a particularly ugly comment, I snapped. "I don't need this," I said, pacing the living room. "I don't need distraction. I don't need drama." He watched me quietly. "Am I distraction?" he asked calmly. The question forced me to stop. "No." "Then what are you afraid of?" "Losing control. Needing someone. Grieving again." "I built this life," I said softly. "I can't afford to let anything shake it." He stepped closer. "Joe," he said gently, "you built a business from grief. You think love is stronger than you?" The words landed deep. I had conquered markets. Negotiated contracts. Managed payroll for over 100 employees. And yet the idea of emotional risk scared me more than any financial one ever had. Because money can be rebuilt. Hearts take longer. But I was learning something essential. Strength that refuses softness becomes isolation. And isolation, no matter how successful, is still lonely. One Sunday morning, as sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, I removed Marcus's boots from beside the door. Not to erase him, but to make room. I placed them carefully in a memory box in the hall closet. Then I stood there for a long moment. Grief didn't leave. It shifted. Later that evening, when Elijah came over, he noticed the empty space. "You okay?" he asked. "Yes," I said. And I was. Because loving again didn't diminish what I had. It expanded who I was allowed to be. But just as my heart began softening, the business faced its biggest threat yet. Not from competitors. Not from family. From within. Because rapid growth hides cracks. And someone inside my company had been making decisions behind my back. Decisions that could collapse everything I built. And this time, the betrayal wouldn't come wrapped in doubt. It would come wrapped in trust. Growth is beautiful from a distance. Up close, it is fragile. The first sign that something was wrong came in numbers. Numbers don't lie, but they whisper before they scream. It was late October. We had just closed our strongest quarter yet. Expansion into 18 states. Negotiations underway with a national retailer. Production at capacity 5 days a week. On paper, everything looked strong. But when I reviewed the inventory reconciliation report one quiet Saturday morning in my office, something felt off. Raw material costs had spiked beyond what supply chain inflation could explain. Waste percentages were inconsistent. Certain vendor invoices were duplicated in subtle ways, slightly altered line items, adjusted quantities. Small discrepancies. Small enough to overlook if you were distracted. I was not distracted. I called in Marcus. Not my Marcus, but Marcus Reed, our operations director. A former warehouse manager I hired during our first major expansion. Solid resume. Calm demeanor. Efficient. Trusted. He stepped into my office carrying a tablet, posture straight. You wanted to see me? Yes, I said, turning my screen toward him. Walk me through this. He leaned over slightly, scanning the spreadsheet. That's just supply volatility, he replied smoothly. Flour prices jumped again. Packaging too. I track commodity trends, I said evenly. This doesn't match market reports. A flicker, barely visible, crossed his face. Could be vendor error. Then I need documentation. He nodded slowly. I'll get that for you. He left without argument. But something in my chest tightened. Instinct. The same instinct that told me Marcus, my husband, wasn't okay that day in the living room. Instinct doesn't shout. It hums. I didn't accuse. I investigated. Quietly. Over the next 2 weeks, I had our finance manager run a deeper audit. Cross-referenced vendor contracts. Pulled shipment logs. Compared signatures. The pattern became clear. Shell vendor accounts. Inflated invoices. Kickbacks routed through a third-party logistics company tied back, indirectly but unmistakably, to Marcus Reed. The betrayal didn't hit me as anger first. It hit me as disbelief. I had sat across from this man dozens of times. Trusted his operational judgment. Defended him when staff questioned minor decisions. He had eaten at my table during a holiday staff gathering. And all the while, he was siphoning from the very foundation we built. Not enough to collapse us. But enough to skim comfort from our scale. Greed rarely empties the vault. It just scrapes quietly. I didn't confront him immediately. Leadership requires control over timing. Instead, I called an emergency board meeting. Yes, somewhere along this climb, I had formed a formal advisory board. Legal. Financial. Strategic. Because empire without structure is ego. When I laid out the evidence, the room went silent. You want to press charges? My attorney asked. I stared at the printed documents spread across the table. Every dollar stolen wasn't just mine. It was payroll. It was healthcare coverage for Denise's children. It was expansion capital. Yes, I said finally. There was no hesitation in my voice. Not because I wasn't hurt. But because legacy requires consequence. The confrontation happened on a Tuesday morning at 9 a.m. I asked Marcus Reed to meet in the conference room. He walked in calm. He did not walk out calm. I laid the evidence out piece by piece. No emotion. No raised voice. Just fact. His composure fractured slowly. You don't understand how much pressure this role carries, he said at one point, desperation leaking through. I deserved more compensation. You negotiated your compensation, I replied. I helped scale this company. Yes, I said evenly. And you chose to scale your pockets too. His jaw tightened. You of all people should understand doing what you have to do to survive. The audacity of that sentence almost made me laugh. Survival is building something from nothing, I said quietly. Not stealing from something already built. He realized then that there would be no emotional manipulation. No mercy based on shared struggle. Security escorted him out. Staff whispers rippled through the facility within hours. By afternoon, the news had begun circulating internally. I gathered department heads in the production area. They stood 6 feet apart. Habit from the pandemic days that never fully left us, faces tense. I need you to hear this from me, I began. My voice did not shake. There was misconduct at the leadership level. It has been addressed. We are cooperating with authorities. No payroll will be affected. No operations will stop. Murmurs. Concern. Fear. I looked at them, really looked. Women who trusted me. Men who relocated families for stable employment here. Single parents. Young professionals. I built this company during a global crisis, I continued. We are not collapsing because of one person's greed. Silence settled. Then Denise, always Denise, spoke from the second row. We with you, Miss Jo. A ripple of agreement followed. In that moment, I understood something profound. Trust flows downward when leadership stands firm. That night, I drove home later than usual. Elijah was waiting in the living room, news already on his phone. You okay? He asked softly. I set my bag down slowly. I am, I said. But the exhaustion behind that statement was heavy. He stepped closer, resting his hands lightly on my shoulders. You handled it? Yes. You sad? I considered that. Yes, I admitted. But not broken. Because betrayal tests identity. If I had built this on ego, it would have shattered me. But I built it on purpose. And purpose survives impact. The media caught wind of the investigation within days. Headlines weren't kind. Rapidly growing food brand faces internal fraud. Competitors circled. Investors paused. For the first time since expansion began, sales dipped. Fear spreads faster than fact. I went on record publicly. No script. No PR spin. Just truth. We discovered misconduct internally. We addressed it immediately. Transparency is non-negotiable in this company. The clips circulated widely. Customer loyalty held. Because trust, once earned honestly, withstands storms. Weeks passed. Legal proceedings moved forward. Operations stabilized. We implemented stronger financial oversight. Dual authorization systems. External audits quarterly. Pain refined us. One evening, long after the facility emptied, I stood alone in the loading bay. The same spot where I once watched our first state shipment roll out. Cold air moved through the open dock. I let myself feel it fully then. The disappointment. The anger. The quiet ache of realizing even in your own house, integrity is not guaranteed. Elijah joined me quietly. You thinking? He asked. Yes. You regret expanding? I shook my head slowly. No. Regret trusting? I thought about that longer. No, I said finally. Trust wasn't the mistake. His character was. He nodded. You still soft enough to love? He asked gently. I looked at him. Yes, I said. But smart enough to verify. He smiled at that. That season hardened my leadership. Not into cruelty. Into clarity. I promoted Denise to operations director temporarily while we searched for a permanent replacement. She cried when I told her. Me? She asked, stunned. Yes, I said. You earned it. Because loyalty should be elevated. Not overlooked. By year's end, we had recovered stronger than before. National retail contracts finalized. Revenue doubled again. Employee count crossed 140. I stood on the production floor one December afternoon watching pallets stack high, organized, efficient, humming with life. And I felt something settle in me. Not pride alone. Peace. I had survived widowhood. Isolation. Doubt. Jealousy. Betrayal. Public scrutiny. And through all of it, I remained standing. But success does not end struggle. It evolves it. Because just as the company stabilized, my mother's health began to decline. And this time, the battle wouldn't be fought in boardrooms or loading docks. It would be fought in hospital hallways. And I would have to confront a different kind of leadership. The kind that doesn't scale. The kind that simply sits beside a bed and remembers who you were before you were strong. Strength looks different in hospital lighting. It doesn't wear blazers or stand behind podiums. It doesn't negotiate contracts or hold press conferences. It sits in stiff vinyl chairs and listens to monitors beep in slow, stubborn rhythm. The call came just after 2 a.m. Patrice's name on my screen. I answered before the second ring. "It's Mama," she said, and I could hear the tremble she was trying to swallow. She collapsed. Everything in my body shifted instantly. Not into panic, but into motion. "What hospital?" she told me. I was dressed and in my car within 5 minutes. The roads were empty, the city quiet in that strange way it had been during the early pandemic days. My headlights cut through darkness that felt too familiar. Hospitals carry a smell you never forget. Antiseptic and something metallic underneath. Controlled sterility wrapped around human vulnerability. I found Patrice in the waiting area, arms crossed tightly over her chest. "They're running tests," she said, avoiding my eyes. I nodded. We sat side by side without speaking. Years of tension, jealousy, distance, all of it temporarily suspended by something bigger. Family. When the doctor finally approached, his face told the story before his mouth did. "Stroke," he said. "Moderate." We acted quickly. Moderate. A word that sounds manageable until you realize it changes everything. They allowed one visitor at a time. Patrice looked at me. "You go first," she said quietly. I walked into my mother's room slowly. She looked smaller somehow. Tubes. Wires. Her silver hair flattened against the pillow. This was the woman who raised me on discipline and scripture. The woman whose doubt once felt like a mountain. Now she looked fragile. I stepped closer to the bed. "Hey, Mama," I said softly. Her eyes opened slowly. Focused. "Found me." "Joanne," she whispered. I hadn't heard my name in that tone in years, not firm, not corrective. Just tender. "I'm here," I said, reaching for her hand. Her fingers felt lighter in mine than I remembered. "They say I'll need help," she murmured. The words carried something unfamiliar. Vulnerability. "I know," I said gently. She looked at me for a long moment. "I didn't think you'd come this fast," she admitted. The statement caught me off guard. "I'm your daughter," I replied. "Yes," she said. "But you're busy now." Busy. That word again. As if my success created distance she assumed I would enforce. "I'm here," I repeated. And I meant it. The following weeks rearranged my world in a way no contract ever had. Rehabilitation schedules. Specialists. Medication management. Home care arrangements. I adjusted my calendar without hesitation. Delegated executive responsibilities. Moved meetings. Because no matter how large my company had grown, I was still somebody's child. And that role does not get outsourced. Patrice and I rotated shifts at the hospital. Long hours. Muted television. Paper cups of lukewarm coffee. Silences that felt less hostile than before. One evening, as we sat watching our mother sleep, Patrice spoke quietly. "You always were stronger than me." I glanced at her. "This isn't strength," I said. "It's love." She shook her head slightly. "No. You do hard things without flinching." I thought about that. I flinch. I just don't fold. "That's because I learned early nobody was coming to save me," I replied softly. She swallowed. "That's not fair," she whispered. Maybe it wasn't. But it was true. One afternoon during therapy exercises, I helped my mother practice lifting her arm. Her face tightened with effort. "I used to carry you," she muttered weakly. I smiled gently. "I know. Now you carry everything," she said. The words landed heavy. Everything. The company. The employees. The contracts. The public image. The relationship. The family expectations. She looked at me differently now. Not as the stubborn daughter chasing ambition, but as the woman who had built something undeniable. "I was afraid," she said suddenly. "Of what?" "That you would fail," she admitted. "And I wouldn't know how to help you recover." I paused. "I didn't need you to prevent my fall," I said quietly. "I needed you to believe I could stand." Her eyes filled. I didn't know how. That was the closest she had ever come to apology. And I realized something important in that moment. Sometimes doubt is just fear wearing authority. She wasn't trying to diminish me. She was trying to protect me from pain she didn't understand. But protection without belief feels like limitation. We arranged for her to move into my home during recovery. The same brick house. The same hallway. The same kitchen where everything began. I converted the guest room into a comfortable suite for her. Installed handrails. Adjusted furniture spacing. Success made those adjustments easier. But the emotional adjustment was harder. Late at night, after checking on her and reviewing company reports, I would sit at the kitchen table alone. Exhaustion felt different now. Not just physical. Layered. Elijah stepped in quietly during that season, driving me to early morning therapy appointments when meetings ran late the night before. Cooking dinner without being asked. Sitting with my mother, listening to her stories about my childhood. One evening, I overheard her telling him, she always was determined. Even when she was little. I leaned against the hallway wall and closed my eyes. That affirmation, spoken to someone else, healed something old inside me. Business continued to grow. But I no longer chased expansion with the same relentless urgency. For the first time, I allowed my executive team to carry weight without me hovering. Denise thrived in leadership. Revenue remained strong. The machine I built ran, not because I controlled every gear, but because I built it well. One afternoon, while helping my mother practice walking slowly across the living room, she paused. "You forgive me?" she asked suddenly. "For what?" "For not seeing you." The question stunned me. I took a breath. "There were seasons you didn't," I admitted. "But I don't need you to go back and change that." She studied my face. "You different now," she said softly. "Yes," I replied. "Harder?" I thought carefully. "No," I said. "Clearer." Because success had not hardened my heart. It had clarified my boundaries. And caregiving softened the parts ambition had tightened. Months passed. Her strength slowly returned. So did mine, in a different way. One Sunday afternoon, we sat together on the porch. Warm sunlight on our faces. Neighborhood quiet. She watched a delivery truck pull up to drop off packaging supplies. "Still busy," she said. "Yes." "You proud?" I looked at the house. The business reports on my phone. The man inside washing dishes. The sister who now called more gently than before. Yes, I said. She nodded slowly. I am too. Simple words. Years late. But right on time. That night, as I locked up the house and checked the security system, I felt something settle deep in my chest. I had built a national brand from grief. I had navigated jealousy, betrayal, public scrutiny. I had loved again. And now I had forgiven without shrinking. That might have been my greatest victory. But legacy still had one more test waiting. Because national success attracts acquisition offers. And soon, a corporation with deep pockets would approach me with a number so large it could change my bloodline forever. The question wouldn't be whether I could build anymore. It would be whether I would sell. And that decision would define not just my wealth, but my story. The email didn't look dramatic. No flashing language. No excessive praise. Just a formal introduction from a national food conglomerate requesting a confidential meeting regarding a strategic acquisition opportunity. Acquisition. That word carries weight. It means someone has decided what you built is valuable enough to own. I read the email twice before forwarding it to my attorney and board chair. Within 48 hours, we were seated in a glass conference room 30 floors above a city I used to drive through without stopping. The skyline stretched wide behind them, 3 executives in tailored suits, polished in a way that suggested inevitability. They complimented the brand's story. The growth curve. The customer loyalty metrics. They called Marcus and Joe's Kitchen a cultural asset with scalable national potential. I listened carefully. Then they slid the number across the table. It was more money than I had ever seen attached to my name. Generational money. The kind that restructures family trees. The kind that makes headlines. For a moment, the room felt very quiet. Not because I was overwhelmed, but because I understood what they were really buying. Not recipes. Not distribution contracts. They were buying narrative. They were buying authenticity. They were buying the grief and grit that made customers feel something when they picked up our product. Of course, one executive added smoothly, you would remain the face of the brand for a transitional period. Transitional. Meaning temporary. Meaning replaceable. They weren't acquiring me. They were acquiring what I built. I folded my hands calmly on the table. What happens to my employees? I asked. We would evaluate redundancies. Redundancies. I thought of Denise. Of the single mothers. Of the warehouse staff who relocated families. What happens to sourcing? I continued. Local vendors? We would optimize supply chain efficiency. Optimize. Corporate language for cheaper. Faster. Less personal. I nodded slowly. Thank you for the offer, I said evenly. We will review. When I stepped out of that building into open air, the wind hit my face sharply. My attorney exhaled beside me. That's life-changing money, he said. I stared out at the traffic below. I know. Most founders take that deal. I'm not most founders. He didn't argue. At home that evening, I sat at my kitchen table, the same table that held unpaid bills years ago, and stared at the ceiling fan turning slow circles. Elijah sat across from me, quiet. They offered to buy you? He asked gently. Yes. He leaned back. You tempted? I didn't answer immediately. Yes, I admitted. Anyone would be. He nodded. But I didn't build this to hand it over the moment it became heavy. He smiled faintly. That's what I thought you'd say. My mother, now steady on her feet again, overheard part of our conversation from the living room. Buy the whole thing, she called out. Yes, ma'am. She walked slowly into the kitchen and lowered herself into a chair. How much? She asked bluntly. I told her. Her eyebrows rose higher than I'd seen in years. That's security, she said quietly. Yes. She studied me. But it ain't ownership. The simplicity of her response startled me. No, I agreed. It's not. That night, I barely slept. Not because I didn't know my answer, but because I understood the magnitude of refusing. Turning down that kind of money changes how people see you. Some call it foolish. Others call it principled. Either way, it defines you. The next morning, I walked through the production floor slowly. Forklifts moving. Music playing softly from someone's speaker. Women laughing near the packaging station. This place didn't feel like an asset. It felt like proof. Proof that I could build without permission. Proof that grief could be transformed into infrastructure. Proof that Black women don't just survive crisis, we architect beyond it. Later that week, I gathered my executive team. I told them about the offer. Gasps. Whispers. Wide eyes. We selling? Denise asked carefully. No, I said firmly. Silence. Then relief. Why relief? Because when ownership changes hands, culture shifts. And we had built something rooted in dignity. I returned to that glass conference room one final time. The executives were confident. Numbers slightly increased. Sweetened language. Strategic promises. I appreciate the opportunity, I said calmly when they finished. But Marcus and Joe's kitchen is not for sale. A pause. One executive leaned forward. Every company has a price. Not this one, I replied evenly. He studied me like I was miscalculating. You could secure generational wealth. I already have, I said. They didn't understand that answer. But I did. Generational wealth isn't just currency. It's ownership. It's equity. It's control of narrative. It's the ability to hire who you want and source how you want and keep the story intact. I walked out lighter than I walked in. Because refusing something that big clarifies who you are. The headlines came anyway. Founder declines multi-million-dollar acquisition. Comment sections erupted. Some praised. Some criticized. Greedy. Brave. Short-sighted. Visionary. I stopped reading after the first hour. Public opinion is wind. It shifts. What matters is foundation. That evening, we held a company-wide meeting. I stood at the front of the production floor, microphone in hand. They tried to buy us, I said plainly. Laughter rippled through the room. And we're still here, someone called out. Yes, I smiled. We're still here. I explained why I declined. Because we answer to purpose, not pressure. Because culture matters. Because what we built together isn't a quick flip. Applause rose, not loud, but steady. That steady sound meant more to me than any acquisition check ever could. Later that night, as I stood alone in the loading bay again, I thought about Marcus. The way he once teased me about selling my pies. The way he believed in something small before it became visible. I whispered into the cool air, we did it. Not in terms of money. In terms of integrity. Elijah stepped beside me, hands in his coat pockets. No regrets, he asked softly. None, I replied. He studied me. You realize you just changed your family's future without selling? Yes. Because now my company wasn't just successful. It was sovereign. And sovereignty feels different than wealth. We began exploring employee equity programs shortly after. Profit-sharing structures. Leadership development pipelines. Scholarship funds for employees' children. If I was building generational wealth, it wouldn't stop at my bloodline. It would ripple outward. Months later, on the anniversary of Marcus's passing, I closed the bakery early. Not out of sadness. Out of remembrance. I stood alone in the original kitchen, still preserved, still functional, and baked one small sweet potato pie. The same recipe. The same scent rising warm into the air. I placed it on the counter and smiled. The world had shut down. My husband had died. My family had doubted. A man had betrayed my trust. A corporation had tried to buy my legacy. And through it all, I remained. Not just standing. Thriving. Not because I was fearless. But because I refused to shrink. If there's anything I've learned through all of this, it's this. Belief doesn't arrive from outside. It grows when you move anyway. When the house is quiet. When the bank account is low. When the room doubts you. When grief presses heavy. You move. And eventually, the world adjusts to the size of your courage. I am not the widow they pitied. I am not the sister they underestimated. I am not the founder they could purchase. I am the woman who heard herself clearly when everything else went silent. And I built something that speaks, loudly, without me ever raising my voice. But this isn't the end. Because legacy isn't a moment. It's a continuum. And what I build next won't just carry my name. It will carry the lesson that saved me. You do not wait to be believed. You build until belief becomes unavoidable. Success is loud in public. Legacy is quiet at home. The year after I declined the acquisition offer was the most intentional year of my life. Not the fastest growing. Not the most headline-worthy. But the most deliberate. When you stop chasing validation, you start designing impact. We launched the employee profit-sharing program that spring. Not symbolic bonuses. Real percentages. Structured equity participation over time. The day I announced it, the room didn't erupt. It went still. Because when people are used to surviving, ownership feels unreal at first. Denise stood beside me, now permanently appointed Chief Operations Officer. Watching her grow into that title has been one of my proudest experiences. You built this with me, I told the team. Now you build it with me for real. One of the warehouse supervisors raised his hand slowly. You serious? Yes. He blinked hard and looked down, nodding. That moment mattered more to me than any magazine feature. Because wealth shared is stability multiplied. At home, life felt different too. My mother moved back into her own house after months of recovery, stronger but slower. Softer in tone. Lighter in spirit. Before she left, she stood in my kitchen, that sacred kitchen, and placed her hand over mine. You built more than a business, she said. You rebuilt yourself. I didn't argue this time. I had to, I replied. Patrice and I found a new rhythm. Not best friends. But honest. One afternoon, she visited the headquarters, not to ask for a position, not to request investment, just to see. We walked the production floor together. You know, she said quietly, I used to think you were chasing attention. I smiled faintly. I wasn't. I know that now. That acknowledgement felt like a closed wound finally sealing. She didn't become an executive in my company. But she did enroll in a business certification program the following fall. I'm building something too, she told me one evening over coffee. That's good, I said. And I meant it. Because my success was never meant to shrink others. It was meant to expand what felt possible. Elijah and I married quietly the next year. No grand spectacle. Just close family and a handful of friends under an open sky behind the bakery headquarters. When I walked down that short aisle, I did not feel like a woman replacing love. I felt like a woman choosing it. There is a difference. After the ceremony, as laughter floated through warm air and the scent of catered dishes mixed with summer grass, Denise pulled me aside. You happy? She asked. Yes, I said without hesitation. Not giddy. Not overwhelmed. Grounded. Because this time, I did not enter marriage as a woman searching for identity. I entered as a woman already formed. Elijah never tried to stand in front of my light. He stood beside it. We built our home life intentionally. Sunday dinners. No phones at the table. Quarterly retreats where we discussed vision, not just business, but family, community, impact. He challenged me in ways Marcus never did. Not because Marcus lacked strength, but because I had grown into a different woman. Stronger. Clearer. Less willing to shrink. The company expanded into international markets by year 8. Selective distribution. Strategic partnerships that honored our sourcing standards. I traveled overseas for the first time representing my own brand. Standing in front of global buyers, I spoke without trembling. Not because I wasn't nervous, but because I knew my story wasn't fragile. It had been tested. And still stood. The scholarship fund we established for employees' children sent its first group to college that same year. At the ceremony, one young woman, daughter of a packaging line worker, hugged me tightly. My mama said you changed our life, she whispered. I held her a little longer than necessary. No, I said softly. Your mama showed up every day. She changed it. But inside, I understood something powerful. Legacy multiplies through consistency. Not flash. Not ego. Just steady, disciplined care. On the 10th anniversary of Marcus and Joe's kitchen, we held a celebration at the original location, preserved exactly as it had been when I first moved operations out. The small storefront. The early branding. Photos lining the walls from the pandemic days. Community members came. Employees past and present. Family. Even the local news station that once labeled me Black Widow turns tragedy into triumph. When they asked me to speak, I stepped to the microphone slowly. I looked out at faces that had witnessed every phase of my becoming. I started this business because I was grieving, I began. But I kept building because I was growing. The crowd quieted. There were seasons I doubted myself. Seasons others doubted me louder. Seasons I almost chose smallness because it felt safer. I paused. But smallness never saved anyone. A ripple of agreement moved through the room. I stand here not as someone who avoided pain, I continued, but as someone who refused to let pain define her ceiling. Applause rose, strong this time. And as I stepped back, I saw my mother wiping her eyes openly. Patrice clapping without restraint. Elijah smiling steady and proud. For the first time, there was no tension in their admiration. Only alignment. Later that evening, after the event ended and the building emptied, I remained alone inside. The hum of refrigeration units sounded almost nostalgic now. I walked slowly through each section. The office where I first reviewed that acquisition offer. The loading dock where I faced betrayal. The conference room where I declined millions. The break room where women once cried in relief over job security. This building carried fingerprints of my evolution. But the real transformation wasn't in the square footage. It was in me. I was no longer building to prove. Not to family. Not to critics. Not to the world. I was building because it is who I am. The girl who once rolled dough at a kitchen counter out of grief had become a woman who negotiates global contracts without flinching. The widow who once whispered into silence now speaks and rooms listen. The daughter who once longed for belief now generates it in others. And perhaps the most beautiful part? I no longer resent the doubt. Because doubt sharpened my clarity. Loneliness strengthened my discipline. Betrayal refined my leadership. Loss softened my heart. If Marcus could see this. And sometimes I imagine he can, I think he would smile that same easy smile and say, I told you folks would line up. They did. But not just for pie. They lined up for proof. Proof that a black woman can lose everything and still architect abundance. Proof that family tension doesn't have to become family fracture. Proof that love after loss is not betrayal. Proof that wealth without ownership is hollow. Proof that softness and strength can coexist. Tonight, as I sit once more at this same wooden kitchen table, older, wiser, steadier, I can hear the quiet differently. It no longer feels heavy. It feels earned. The world once shut down around me. Now it opens doors. But I never forgot the lesson silence taught me. When everything stops. Listen. That's where your real voice lives. And once you hear it clearly. Build. Not until they believe you. Build until you believe yourself so deeply that whether they do or not no longer matters. That is the legacy. That is the woman I became. And I am still becoming. There is a strange thing that happens when your life stabilizes after chaos. You begin to hear questions you were too busy surviving to ask. Not financial questions. Not strategic ones. But spiritual ones. What now? I used to think success was a destination, a place you arrive, unpack, and rest. But success is movement. If you stop directing it, it begins directing you. 3 months after our 10th anniversary celebration, I found myself restless in a way I hadn't felt since the early days of the pandemic. Not anxious. Not overwhelmed. Just aware. Aware that what I built could not rely solely on my presence forever. That awareness humbled me. Because if Marcus and Joe's kitchen only thrived when I was at the center, then I had built a monument, not a system. And monuments crumble. Systems endure. So I began succession planning. Not because I was stepping down, but because leadership without preparation is ego. Denise and I spent long evenings mapping out structural layers, leadership councils, decision-making frameworks, mentorship tracks for emerging managers. I started stepping back in small ways. Not disappearing. Just creating room. In meetings, I asked more questions than I answered. When major retail contracts surfaced, I let my executive team lead negotiations while I observed. It wasn't easy. Control is seductive. Especially when you fought for it. But I understood something clearly now. If I hoarded control, I would eventually suffocate the very thing I loved. One afternoon, after a strategy session ran long, I remained in the conference room alone. The city skyline shimmered outside the window. I thought about the version of me who once sat in a silent house, terrified of losing everything. That woman clung tightly to whatever she could build. This woman understood release. Growth requires both grip and grace. Around that same time, we launched the Marcus and Joe Foundation, a nonprofit branch dedicated to funding small food entrepreneurs in underserved communities, specifically Black women navigating grief, transition, or single parenthood. When I announced it publicly, interviews poured in. Why this focus? Reporters asked. Because I know what it feels like to stand alone with an idea and no backup, I replied simply. But privately, it was deeper. I wanted to disrupt the narrative that we only survive. I wanted us funded. Supported. Structured. Within the first year, we awarded 15 grants. 15 women. 15 stories beginning in kitchens that smelled like possibility and fear at the same time. At the inaugural foundation dinner, I walked table to table listening to their plans. Catering services. Food trucks. Specialty bakeries. Meal prep for seniors. Each woman's voice trembled slightly when she described her dream. Not because she doubted it. But because she wasn't used to saying it out loud. I recognized that tremble. It lived in my throat once too. That night, after everyone left, I sat alone in the ballroom long after the staff began stacking chairs. The air smelled faintly of lemon polish and leftover spices. I closed my eyes and allowed myself a rare moment of full stillness. This was beyond profit. This was multiplication. At home, Elijah noticed the shift in me. "You're lighter," he said one evening while we washed dishes together. "I think I've stopped proving," I replied. "And started planting?" "Yes." He smiled softly. "Planting feels different than fighting. Fighting is survival. Planting is faith." My relationship with my family deepened in unexpected ways over the years. Patrice's small consulting firm gained traction, and she began collaborating with our foundation on business planning workshops. Watching her teach rooms of young entrepreneurs with confidence filled me with quiet pride. We had grown from comparison to collaboration. My mother, now fully retired, began volunteering weekly at the foundation office. She answered phones, sorted mail, greeted women walking in with nervous eyes. One afternoon, I overheard her telling a young applicant, "Baby, if my daughter can do it, so can you." That sentence alone healed something inside me I didn't realize was still tender. Because belief, when it finally arrives from those who once doubted, feels like sunlight on old scars. Years continued moving, steady, intentional. Expansion into select international markets strengthened. We opened a training institute attached to headquarters where culinary and small business education merged. The building buzzed daily with students learning everything from supply chain logistics to branding ethics. Not just how to cook. How to own. Ownership became my quiet obsession. I spoke about it everywhere. Panels. Conferences. Podcasts. But I refused to romanticize the grind. When interviewers tried to frame my story as effortless resilience, I corrected them gently. I was afraid often, I would say. I just moved anyway. Because emotional honesty builds trust. And I had no interest in becoming myth. Myth distances. Truth connects. One autumn evening, long after the offices emptied, I returned to the original kitchen once more. The counters still carried faint marks from those early pandemic days. I ran my fingers over the surface. Closed my eyes. I could almost hear the first mixer whirring. Feel the tension in my shoulders from sleepless nights. Smell uncertainty in the air. And I smiled. Not because it was easy. But because it was mine. Grief once hollowed me out. Now purpose filled the space. As I stood there, I realized something I hadn't said aloud yet. Marcus's death was not my origin story. My courage was. Loss may have been the catalyst. But the strength was always inside me. I just hadn't needed to use it at that scale before. That realization freed me from being defined by tragedy. I was not the widow who built. I was a builder who happened to be widowed. That distinction matters. It restores agency. When I finally returned home that night, Elijah was asleep on the couch, a book resting open on his chest. I covered him with a blanket gently and turned off the lamp. Before heading upstairs, I paused at the window. The neighborhood was quiet. Streetlights casting soft gold circles on pavement. For the first time in years, there was no fire to put out. No crisis looming. Just steady existence. Peace can feel unfamiliar when you've lived in survival. But I have learned to sit with it now. To breathe in it. To trust it. Because the work that outlives me won't be measured only in revenue or reach. It will be measured in the women who believed a little sooner because they saw me. In the families stabilized by opportunity. In the daughters who grow up watching their mothers own something outright. In the sons who learn that strength looks like partnership, not control. And when the day comes, many years from now, that I step fully away from daily operations, I will not feel loss. I will feel completion. Because legacy is not about being irreplaceable. It is about building something that no longer requires you to survive. If you are listening to my story and standing at the edge of your own beginning, here is what I want you to know. You do not need unanimous belief. You do not need perfect timing. You do not need family applause. You need clarity. And the courage to move while your voice shakes. The world will test you. People may underestimate you. Grief may visit. Money may tighten. Doors may close. But if you build with integrity and refuse to abandon yourself in the process, something extraordinary happens. Not overnight. Not magically. But steadily. You become undeniable. And not because you forced the world to see you, but because you finally saw yourself. I began this journey in a silent house during a global shutdown. Today, the house is warm. The world is open. And I am not just surviving it. I am shaping it. And I am still building.